Now, let's be honest for a moment, many of us are becoming worn with Hollywood right now, thanks to their unimaginative concepts that are rife with political insertions, creating wasted potentials, particularly to long-time franchises, that is all working to deliver diminishing returns and create a swell of animosity from general audiences who don't trust this industry to do anything for anyone anymore.
You're goddamn right.
And lest we forget the perpetual use of unpopular actors and actresses that do nothing to encourage viewership thanks to their personal exploits making the evening news, coupled with the exhaustive attempts at regurgitating nostalgia at the expense of timeless works of art to accommodate modern audiences that are never grateful for the utter shit that they ultimately receive anyway.
It's funny because it's true.
So when shit hits the fan, and generally the current releases aren't quite cutting it, people have started to realise the value in older entries, and have taken to digging through those filing cabinets inside their heads in search of excitement, imagination, sincerity, and vindication in the thought that what came before, in most cases, was infinitely better than what we have today.
No, he's got a point.
And over recent weeks I too have been dusting off the cobwebs from my own collection in search of inspiration while the theatres dry up for the foreseeable future, as many movies are delayed indefinitely due to Hollywood's sheer incompetence.
You fool.
My journey to the Well of Wonder began tearing through classic titles like Police Academy, Terminator, Flubber and Mean Girls in the quest for something tangible to discuss. But among the many titles I possess, one struck me as a missing memory from yesteryear belonging to the Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles.
I'm listening.
And that was the 2007 CGI TMNT movie. An effort from Warner Brothers done to keep a then stagnant franchise going with an idea that was presented 7 years earlier and remained in production hell till then. And it was done as a means to suspend the viewer's belief of what the Turtles could be, with more brooding visuals and organic movements that before possessed a variety of limitations in the practicality of the costumes and motions that pulled many viewers like myself out of the drama due to the visible nature of it, even though I do think they did a good job for the time they were in. So in the grand scheme of things, this was a novel concept in retrospect and clearly saved on the budget, although it was never going to be a simple task with integrating the Turtles into live action, so I don't know why they wouldn't just stick with animation anyway, but here we are. Now, for what it's worth, I can see all the criticisms with this one, and I will point out the majority of them, but if I'm being honest, I actually feel this is a decent inclusion from our friendly sewer dwellers, if you don't think too hard on it.
What fun.
What fun!
As it both presents the boys in a new light, creating a new story outside of their eternal conflict with the Shredder in a piece of failed writing potential, but also acts as an example of how the live action costumes could have looked all this time. And even though this idea was presented back in 2000, I think it was worth the wait to put this one out there with better software and technological advancements that could lift this idea into the modern age without the possibility of compromised visuals to accompany it. Among the many creative faults with this one problem I believe that isolated it is that it came at a time that audiences were starting to tire of the heroes in a half shell, due to the 2003 weekly series that was ongoing around its release, but that also had fleshed the brothers out more effectively and more meaningfully. Then the director for this, Kevin Munro, wished to deviate from the light-hearted beats to the brothers that many had grown to enjoy, and instead opted to focus on the darker tone of the comics, forgetting that they still carried an essential component to the heroes in a half shell in the quips and remarks.
Of course.
Then there was a lack of credible character shifts or refreshing takes on the four treble terrapins, sticking with the fractured family dynamic that every Turtles property had tackled up to that point to a mind-numbing degree, made this feel ultimately pointless as there was nothing to engage with, no ulterior reason for their breakdown or nothing meaningful to come from it. And then sadly the lack of trust from audiences due to the poorly received third entry a little over 10 years before meant that this didn't have the strongest legs to stand on coming out the gates. And if you account for the word of mouth following its release that said it was essentially the same as it ever was, no one was willing to give it a chance beyond the hardcore fanbase that want to watch everything from them.
Gotta catch 'em all!
Which meant of course that this movie developed a shaky reputation as the years went by, falling into obscurity thanks to the Michael Bay movies and the better crafted works from television. But incredibly, with the release of Mutant Mayhem stirring up the Turtle fans once again, it's meant that there's a new spotlight that's been cast on this version of the Green Beans, which I love to see as it isn't as bad as people say.
My man.
This version of events picks up some time after the destruction of the Shredder, continuity of which is unknown however, and we see that following the fall of their greatest adversary, the Turtles have fallen into despair, grown apart, and have begun living hollow lives.
You're the worst.
with Donnie starting an IT business, Mikey dressing up for birthday parties, and Leo venturing out into Central America for further training but choosing to stay. And of course that leaves Raph, who's become a recluse, donning a new identity as the masked vigilante the Night Watcher to continue his efforts in protecting the city, whilst April and Casey have become embroiled in a shipping company for antiquities, who coincidentally assist this movie's pseudo-antagonist Max Winters, with locating and retrieving ancient statues and relics that he's long searched for, and we later find out is immortal and desperate to right the wrongs of his past, where centuries before he opened up a portal to a parallel universe that granted him such a gift of immortality but also released 13 monsters alongside it that went on to destroy his armies, and fill the roles of mythical monsters like Bigfoot over the years, and at the same time Winters lost his 4 generals who were petrified into stone and left scattered across the earth.
Alrighty then.
And after the 4 return to Winters in the present, he thaws them out and sends them off with the task of collecting the 13 monsters that disappeared, to undo what occurred and allow Winters to become mortal again. However, the generals have a plan of their own, and that is to intercept this and take the immortality for themselves.
Can't be that easy. It's that easy.
And whilst this all unfolds, April finds Leo and convinces him to return home, where he's met with warmth from all but Wrath, who felt that he gave up on them in favour of being a better leader than a brother. And as Mikey and Donnie wouldn't listen to Wrath, the Rageful One took things into his own hands and fought for New York for all of them. And during this as well, the group encounter a few of the 13 monsters, the returning Foot Clan, and the generals, with various fights taking place, and upon Wrath being discovered as the Night Watcher, Leo shuts that down pretty quickly. And after Wrath fights him and leaves him behind, Leo is caught as the final monster for Winters' machine as a ploy to get the portal open for their plans, and Wrath returns home with the information to get the gang back together to take on the combined forces of Karai, the Foot, the generals, and the monsters in an effort to save Leo, which they manage to achieve with shifting allegiances from Karai and the Foot, and following an awesome action set piece against the generals and a moment of misdirect, the boys, Splinter, April, and Casey succeed in their mission by luring the actual missing monster to them and booting the living boulders back through the portal, killing them and releasing Winters from his curse, and the group swear to stick together now.
Now I'm standing. You all happy? We're all standing up now. Bunch of jackasses standing in a circle.
So that was a rather basic summation of this movie, but those are the primary points of focus that explain what occurs here. But truthfully, despite the criticisms towards this dominating the conversation half the time, I think this movie is deserving of your attention. And you can certainly say that there are some disappointments here, starting with Mikey and Donnie ultimately being cameos in a Turtles movie and treated as a little more than afterthoughts, with the focus being drawn toward Raph and Leo like usual, where it might have been nice to reset the formula somewhat and drive attention to the others or the group collectively. And if you've watched the 2003 series, you know that Mikey and Donnie can have some genuinely fun and fierce adventures that have done well to shift that familial paradigm. Then Karai and the Foot becoming muscle for hire was a colossal waste of their characters and made me wish that they weren't even part of this to begin with, as they felt incredibly last minute and really added nothing to the plot beyond the possibility of becoming a future antagonist for the unproduced sequel. The group becoming muscle for hire was honestly the most generic use for them, and they felt like they were simply warm bodies to give us those little fight sequences towards the end. And what's worse is Karai's inclusion was never going to work without the explanation of what transpired in this universe with the Shredder, as her relationship is kind of predicated on her connection and her father's connection to them. The Foot for me were always seen as a global organization, born from a corrupt lineage with various strongholds, uncompromising leaders, and loyalists everywhere laced with honor despite their villainous actions. So this did feel like a major disservice to competently written characters, but here you go.
You know why? Because you, that's why.
The generals and Winters' stories never really received the necessary attention to make them compelling or engaging enough in my mind, and the time spent with the generals never left me feeling that they could be considered legitimate threats, even though their designs were intense, and there was more that I think could have been explored with them. But there you go. There was ultimately nothing rich or thought-provoking to them, so they were just left feeling like weightless opportunities. Winters himself was an endearing character and had a noble intention behind his quest for the generals, but I would have loved to add some more depth to his involvement too, as he had clearly seen the error of his ways, but how did he come to that realization? I wouldn't have minded a little short or something to explain his history. As we can see depicted in his office, he becomes various historical figures within this universe.
You gotta be kidding me.
The constant bickering between Raph and Leo that plays out across every iteration of the Turtles at this point has become rather exhausting, and frankly, when your antagonists are practically non-existent throughout this, and there's no customary Shredder, the weight of this one will fall apart somewhat, as there's no great attention to bolster it, and leaving that to Raph and Leo's brewing tension isn't enough to carry a full movie plot. And drawing back a bit, there was no Shredder, who is the Joker to the Turtles as Batman and Thanos to their Avengers. He is an essential component to any universe of the TMNT, and it's never that he's too much or overdone in my mind, it comes down to what you do with him, especially seeing the works put into his legacy over the years since the 90s movies, where the 03 series had him as a mystical legacy from feudal Japan, then the 2012 show introduced him as a crime boss with uncompromising beliefs. So you can work the Shredder in any time so long as you have something to separate him from previous entries or do better than what came before. He's one villain that I love to see in every iteration where possible, so to remove that connection will always leave you struggling. Unless you have something credible to replace him that is as detrimental of a force for the boys to compete with as he is, which was one of my biggest criticisms with Mutant Mayhem. And lastly, the weightless inclusions of April and Casey were rather frustrating when you consider how much the duo were offered in previous and future entries, that leaves them both feeling fleshed out and considerable additions to the group that possess their own agencies and talents that the Turtles couldn't perform. And I'm starting to realise that this is just becoming one long critique of the movie when I said that there were things to appreciate with it, so let's move on before I digress any further. I believe the fun can be found with this if you don't think too hard on it or try to compare it to previous iterations and take it for what it is. Like the jovial nature to the group, which many felt was lacking compared to its counterparts, but it did draw a few chuckles out of me as it conveys the comical nature that we know these characters to have, just in a more muted manner, and this is something that I mentioned in my previous Turtle reviews. It is an element that the writers and cast and directors need to prioritise when forming the boys, as their interactions need to feel organic and familial with the perfect comedic chops and timing.
But he's right.
The brooding tone that they attempted with this did conflict with the screenplay, as it felt like it wanted to be darker than it sounded, but otherwise it did feel reminiscent in places of what we know as well. The Turtles' personalities felt present with distinct characteristics that separate them aside from their coloured masks, and whilst I didn't love James Arnold and Nolan North's portrayals of Leo and Raph respectively in this, I will confess the pair did a decent job with their roles. But I will admit that having a sizable portion of this cast be big time hitters like Nolan North, James Arnold Taylor, Patrick Stewart, Chris Evans, Sarah Michelle Gellar and Lawrence Fishburne was never going to carry this one for you like they might have thought behind the scenes. As I've often found that you can have some fantastic talent attached to a project, but if the screenplay and writing isn't enough, then there's never going to be enough of a performance in the world that can save a movie or show. It certainly lacks in areas for sure, but what movie doesn't normally? It certainly isn't as refined or expositional as we may have needed for such a feature, particularly one that seems confuddled as whether it exists or doesn't exist in the same continuity to previous titles or not, and I would have appreciated more time with the villains who had clear goals but no context or further information behind them, which did leave them feeling rather underwhelming and devoid of impact. Mikey, Donnie, April and Casey were done dirty here with little contribution to the plot or thought towards their involvements. However, they were all generally entertaining, and I understand that people are warm with the Shredder, but imagine his character style in this and who they could have casted for the role that could have added some weight to it. However, when all is said and done, the tone of this movie, the music, the choreography, visuals, and ensemble cast tied this up quite nicely to be a comfortable, easygoing addition from the Turtles, and to this day I believe is the only movie in the franchise of TMNT to not receive a follow-up due to Nickelodeon buying the rights in 2009. This is absolutely a flawed entry from the Turtles, but in my opinion is leagues above the Bay movies and the OG titles, both stylistically and aesthetically. And with a little more consideration for the direction and writing to this iteration, we could have been underway with a possible win for the lean green butt-kicking machines, but such is the way of things sometimes. Anyway, that's all I've got for this one. If you like this, leave a thumbs up, and if you're new, subscribe for more reviews of your favourite movies and shows down the road. And until next time everyone, take care, and I will catch you later.